Hey folks, I'm brownbear. Today I'll be doing an in-depth review of StarCraft 2's cooperative mode. As part of this review, I'll be covering every aspect of the game mode, commander designs, the progression system, mission structure, and everything in between. You don't need any background in co-op, StarCraft, or even real-time strategy to follow this video. The only thing I recommend is watching it from beginning to end. That said, if you do prefer to skip around, there are timestamps in the description below. If you're not familiar with my work, I've been playing real-time strategy games for over 20 years, spending the last 4 creating content on computer game design. I started playing StarCraft 2 with Legacy of the Void, and focused mostly on the 1v1 ladder. I'm currently in Masters 1 in the North American region. Last year, I researched and produced a 2-hour in-depth commentary series on the game's competitive mode, diving into everything from game balance and mechanics to graphical style and design intent. This year, I decided to give the same treatment to the cooperative mode. As part of this review, I completed over 300 games of co-op, maxing out every single commander, playing 14 different mutations, and reaching mastery level 55. Cooperative missions, typically shortened as co-op, launched alongside Legacy of the Void in 2015. In co-op, players partner up to tackle campaign-style missions. Each mission features unique objectives and design elements, plus a set of common features that span across most or all of them. Recurring attack waves, expansion to a second base, optional objectives, and some level of either implicit or explicit cooperation between players. Primary objectives are typically structured in sets or waves, like the 4 sets of Rifts in Rifts to Core Hall, or the 8 waves of trains in Oblivion Express. One of the most important decisions players make is the commander they select prior to starting the game. Commanders are borrowed from the game's extensive backstory, featuring fan favorites like Kerrigan, Raynor, and Artanis. Each commander features different unlockable units and upgrades, giving each a unique set of viable playstyles. Raynor is a rugged, bio-focused commander with lots of mechanical depth. Kerrigan centers around a primary hero unit. Artanis protects units from dying while fielding a beefy Protoss composition, and so on for the rest of the commanders. In general, while commanders may anchor themselves to the style and mechanics of the 3 core races, each ends up feeling distinct in practice thanks to differences in units, technology, unlocks, and abilities. The unlock progression in particular is one of co-op's keystone features. At a high level, it serves 2 purposes. First, unlocks act as a primary reward mechanism. Players are incentivized to keep playing with a continuous stream of rewards that they get as they level up. Second, unlocks drive playstyle selection by co-locating related rewards, preventing players from getting bored and plumbing additional depth out of individual commanders. Of these 2 aspects, the rewards piece is the most visible and arguably the most important. Unlocks are rewarding in part because they noticeably increase player power. Kerrigan's units become exceptionally good on creep at level 7. Swan's drones provide free gas to both players at level 5, and Artanis starts at 200 supply at level 15. There's a huge difference between playing a maxed out commander and a starting one. Putting aside the playstyle selection that we'll discuss later on, maxed out commanders are simply across the board superior to their lower level counterparts. This affects how co-op is balanced. The meaningfulness of rewards is necessarily relative to the pre-reward mentality. If the experience were already easy, the player wouldn't notice if it became even easier. To solve this problem, the co-op experience is necessarily balanced around higher level commanders. This allows the unlock system to step in and make the player feel more powerful, at the cost of making the experience noticeably more difficult for lower level commanders. Co-op mitigates this trade-off through its difficulty system. It encourages players to start at normal and incrementally move up as they increase in level. The key here is that the core reward loop remains intact, at least from my perspective. The increase in experience from playing at higher difficulties ensures that players see them as a reward in and of themselves. Instead of a sense of moving 2 steps forward and 1 step back, players perceive themselves as having unlocked a higher risk, higher reward scenario. In other words, even though gaining a level and increasing the difficulty might make the player feel less powerful than gaining the level in isolation, the player doesn't necessarily see it that way. They start from the perspective of just taking 1 step forward. In general, the choice to balance map difficulty against commander level reveals an interesting tension between the progression system and the degree to which co-op rewards player skill. Consider for instance the efficacy of Nova, one of the most popular player commanders, going up against a Zerg Lingbane ground composition on Brutal. The hard limits on Nova's macro mechanics make it difficult for players to win based on skill alone. There's only so much you can do with a handful of units against multiple waves of banelings. Instead, the easiest way to solve this problem is to lower the difficulty or grind levels to get powerful upgrades. By level 15, these render Nova's units virtually invincible and eliminate any control requirements beyond attack move. Depending on your perspective, you might consider this unfair, especially if you have a strong background on the competitive ladder. You might imagine an alternative approach in which the designers first balance co-op around commander level and ensure that unlocks provide suitably powerful buffs to their more casual target audience. After this was completed, the designers could then add optional components to reward higher skilled players, opportunities to leverage strong mechanics or tactical thinking to win even when using a very low level commander. As it stands, co-op has decided against many such high skill opportunities. Enemy armies simply materialize out of thin air, and as the Nova example demonstrates, you'll eventually run out of options against an overwhelming number of higher quality units. While it is true that there are ways to game the system, particularly within the speedrunning community, I see this more as an edge case rather than an intended aspect of the design. In general, the solution for players having a hard time was to level up or lower the difficulty. By contrast, raw skill development, while a component of co-op's engagement system and something we'll discuss later on, is not typically the primary means of tackling difficult situations. It's worth thinking about why the development team did it this way. I'll start with a quote from Monk, one of the newest designers on the co-op team. In a community update a few months back, he explained Blizzard's philosophy in this area. "We're not saying that skill shouldn't be rewarded when playing Raynor, or any other co-op commander for that matter. Rather, we believe that the playing field between beginners and veterans isn't as even as we'd like." I see this partly as a diplomatic statement from a developer speaking to a diverse and vocal fanbase. Co-op is not strictly balanced for either hardcore or casual players, but rather strives for a happy middle ground. But the emphasis on leveling the playing field points to the development team's philosophy when it comes to designing co-op. The experience is not strictly balanced around high-skilled players, evaluating instead the entire range of player opinions as an input to design decisions. Consider the high-skill opportunities I mentioned earlier. In this case, players sometimes get confused if they're offered multiple approaches to a given problem. If players had the choice to multitask and harass Amon economically in order to cripple incoming attack waves, they might lose focus on the more important concept of leveling. This could end up being very frustrating. It's similar to the way players find the competitive ladder too mechanical, even though mechanics are rarely the limiting factor for the vast majority of the player base. In other words, it's not enough for unlocks to tangibly make players more powerful. Players also need to perceive and leverage this increase in power in order for the reward to work. Introducing a separate set of features to reward high-skilled players might end up distracting from this setup, so it didn't get included in the base co-op experience, at least from my perspective. This choice limitation technique is a key component of co-op's accessibility design, and one of its starkest contrasts with the competitive ladder. That mode arguably strives to get players to figure things out in order to deliver a feeling of accomplishment and growth. This divergence in accessibility design is a pattern we'll continue to see as we go further in this review. Before we dive further into the unlock system, I'd like to take a step back and provide context. One of the themes we'll see throughout this review is the contrast in design between co-op at launch and co-op as it plays today after several years of content updates. It's hard to speak generally about the game mode without drawing this distinction because of the substantial evolution in design over the past 2.5 years. That's not to say that co-op at launch is somehow unrecognizable compared to the co-op of today, nor is it to say that the original content no longer holds up with the passage of time. Rather, it's simply to point out that the development team evolved the game mode in response to player feedback. I'd argue that co-op has gone through 3 stages of development. First came the initial concept, creating a more accessible version of the classic multiplayer experience. Next, the developers iteratively experimented with new maps, commanders, and game modes much more removed from the classic StarCraft experience. Finally, the developers began to refine their vision and fix design and balance issues that inevitably emerged in the previous 2 phases, which is roughly where the game mode stands today. My best guess is that the expansion and refinement phases will repeat in a tight loop until the next big RTS, but that's only conjecture on my part. The unlock progression design is a good way to explain my perspective. Co-op launched with 6 commanders: Raynor, Kerrigan, Swan, Artanis, Zagera, and Vorazin. Each features what I'll call a ladder fantasy component. They offer an experience players wish they could have on the competitive ladder, but for design and balance reasons just isn't feasible. Take Raynor. At level 1, he's very similar to a standard Bio-Terran. He inherits the basic Depot, Rax, Gas opener. He takes an orbital command. He builds off of a Marine medic composition to expand onto his natural. He transitions into multiple barracks backed by double engineering bay, and he spends the rest of the game playing a bio-heavy MMM style. His economy is balanced around mules, and he uses scans to find cloaked units. This changes as the player levels up and incrementally smooths out the more frustrating aspects of the Bio-Terran experience. Tedious rally points are replaced by drop pods. Supply depots are built instantly. Units train more rapidly, feature more hit points, and attack faster. At launch, Raynor even gained a superpowered mule ability at level 15, deploying 2 instead of 1 and leading many players to mass orbital commands going into the late game. What I find striking about these unlocks is the way they dovetail with the competitive ladder. Rallying units manually is only a minor inconvenience, especially at lower difficulties where F2 and A move are a perfectly sound army management strategy. However, your perspective shifts a bit when you compare this to the classic ladder experience, where finding yourself out of position can be particularly painful. Viewed in this light, always having units exactly where you need them feels pretty great. Instantly resolving supply blocks is another good example. It's certainly convenient, but on the surface it seems very esoteric. Why not something flashier and more exciting? But anyone who's gotten supply blocked on the ladder can cherish the experience of resolving the issue instantly. This goes back to the original goal of providing a more accessible version of the classic multiplayer experience. At launch, co-op sat firmly in the shadow of its more famous competitive counterpart. Raynor acts as a sort of fantasy version of the gameplay you might see on the ladder, smoothing over the stumbling blocks that turn off most players. Imagine if you were never out of position. Imagine if you never got supply blocked. Imagine if bioarmies weren't so fragile and didn't require so much micromanagement. Imagine if, instead of being balanced around rhythmically dropping mules, your race had an objectively superior economy as a result of them. The unlocks are fine on their own, but what makes them stand out is the natural comparison players will make to the ladder. The idea that you can enjoy the same classic StarCraft experience without any of its mechanical and strategic constraints. You can apply the same structure to the other 5 commanders. Imagine if your Archons could use Storm, and instead of friendly fire, they actually healed friendly units. Imagine if Zerg units weren't just faster on creep, but stronger too. Imagine if mech players could never run out of gas. Imagine if massing Dark Templar was an actually viable playstyle. Imagine if you had limitless larvae and an endless swarm of multi-splitting banelings. Now it's worth mentioning that this was probably also a practical decision. Co-op was a brand new game mode, and its initial launch had to be close enough to what players were familiar with in order to be accessible. But I think there's more to it than that. Even a conservative initial concept could have progressed into something much more radically different than the ladder, but the designers opted not to go this way. Arguably the biggest element of ladder fantasy can be seen in the unit choices themselves, in particular the reintroduction of Brood War units back into a mainline multiplayer mode. Medics, Scourge, Dragoons, and Goliaths tie in explicitly to the classic experience many players craved. Goliaths have been a long sought after item from Terran mech players. Meanwhile, the reintroduction of Dragoons dominates the top comments of the co-op missions announcement video. I found Dragoons to be particularly interesting given the large overlap they have with the Stalker. It shows that the decision to bring units back wasn't an exclusively or even primarily gameplay driven decision. Instead, I'd wager that the designers thought that a great way to make multiplayer more accessible would be to give the players what they asked for, rather than what would be quote-unquote good for the game. Given that the strict constraints of competitive multiplayer no longer existed, the designers were free to bring back units that would have otherwise felt like an anachronism in the face of smoother pathing and stronger unit AI. This ladder fantasy, alongside a ton of other factors that we'll discuss later, proved to be a great success, allowing the developers to move confidently into a phase of expansion and experimentation. The designers began adding new commanders and incrementally tweaking co-op as they received player feedback, and it's here where I think the design philosophy started to noticeably shift. Alarak is a good example of the change in direction. While he keeps one foot firmly on the side of the classic experience, he also breaks away from that game mode in a much more substantial way than the original 6 commanders. For example, while he retains the core Protoss units, the names and upgrades have all been changed. His 2 primary unit compositions, Wrathwalkers and Ascendants, function very differently from their latter counterparts. The Zealot is stripped out entirely and replaced by the Supplicant, a completely different kind of unit that feels surprisingly weak on its own. Alarak himself features a unique absorption mechanic in which he literally consumes the units around him. This is a much more radical concept than the tidy double-lift Phoenixes or mass DTs of Artanis and Vorzin respectively. While Alarak is still recognizable as a Protoss commander, he's on a much longer leash from the classic experience. In contrast with the much more straight-laced Artanis and Vorzin, it's quite easy to be a good Protoss player and still have no idea how to play Alarak correctly. The absorption mechanic in particular is incredibly punishing. There's nothing else quite like it in the base game. This pattern continues with commanders released later in the cycle. Dehaka, Stukov, and Han and Horner diverge completely from the classic multiplayer experience. Dehaka puts his units into primal combat. Stukov is a Terran Zerg hybrid. And Han and Horner build flying galleons, which can not only be upgraded to function like carriers, but also act as your primary production buildings. There's no discernible anchor whatsoever to the core competitive experience. By the time this video gets released, I'll have played more than 5,000 games of StarCraft, and even I had to spend my first moments with Dehaka studying the unit upgrade tabs, just to understand how he worked. It's worth digging into this just to marvel at how differently Dehaka plays from the base StarCraft experience. Instead of offering upgrades to supply, the concept is stripped out completely. So too is the notion of dedicated upgrade structures, or separate upgrades for different kinds of units. The latter design shift was also applied to Han and Horner. Dahaka's core unit compositions come from the Zerg, but his production functions more like a Protoss-Terran hybrid. Instead of making injects free, like Abathur, the larva concept was simply removed entirely. All of Dahaka's buildings are unique to the commander. Furthermore, some of them actually cost supply, something that I found so surprising that I had to double and triple check it to make sure I wasn't misunderstanding something. I'll pull a quote here from the developers to try to underline their post-launch thought process. In a 2016 interview, Alan Dilling, the assistant art director on StarCraft 2, had this to say when discussing the runaway success of co-op. "I'm still super excited about the co-op because we get to break a lot of the game rules. Single player has a very strict narrative story we tell. Multiplayer has very strict rules because of the meta and the competitive landscape. But with co-op, we just keep coming up with crazy ideas like Stukov. He's really stretching the boundaries for us as to the things we can do in an RTS." If Reinor's developers asked what the fantasy bioladder experience would be like, Dahaka's developers asked what casual players would want if they were given a blank slate. The result is a completely unique experience unlike anything else in the classic multiplayer. That's not to say that one is better or worse than the other, nor is it to say that they don't have tons of design elements in common. Rather, it's just to say that they're different, and this puts a limitation on the types of direct comparisons you can do. Alrighty, now that I've established the baseline notion of design evolution, I would like to talk about the unlock progression as a general concept. While it follows the same general pattern of shifting away from a focus on ladder fantasy, its form and fundamental purpose has remained consistent throughout co-op's lifecycle. I mentioned earlier that the progression system plays two distinct roles. One, it's the primary reward mechanism, and two, it's used to drive playstyle selection. I'd like to dig a little deeper into this and try to define a model for how co-op's reward loop actually works. I think the developers have done a great job here in establishing an engaging and consistent reward system. Furthermore, I think the general principles are reusable in other RTS games. Commanders flow through a reward loop that starts with a new gameplay approach. At level 1, this is typically the commander's unique hook. This could be an emphasis on a particular class of fighting units, the existence of a hero unit, or some other kind of major alteration on the core StarCraft gameplay. At higher levels, it's usually a novel approach toward the core hook, like Swan's Thors or Phoenix's AI champions, or sometimes even entirely new playstyles, like Artanis' Stargate play. Next, the progression system reinforces this new approach with a series of rewards. These are often things like upgrade caches or passive buffs. It's worth noting that while rewards are not necessarily adjacent, they are typically co-located. For example, Nova's Starport and Raven upgrade caches are 2 levels apart, but in between is a general upgrade that buffs tech labs across the board. In combination, these two types of rewards act like a 1-2 punch. First, the player is encouraged to play the game in a certain way. Then, the new playstyle is reinforced with a substantial buff. Interspersed among these playstyle selection rewards are what I'll call power spikes, just like the tech lab buff we just mentioned. These are typically call-down abilities, passive buffs, or other kinds of gameplay changes that make a commander stronger on an overall basis. Examples here include Kerrigan's creep upgrades at level 7, Forazen's time stop ability at level 10, and Abathur's Locust spawns at level 13. In some cases, you could argue that the power spike is minimal because the upgrade itself is not that strong, but the general principle still applies. If we put these 3 concepts together, we end up with the following. The player unlocks a new angle on their commander's playstyle at level N. This new approach is reinforced with rewards for the next 1 to 3 levels. And finally, the experience is capped off with an overall power boost. The overall cycle runs between 6 and 8 games, enough to learn the ins and outs of a playstyle without getting bored. The small number of levels also gives the designers space to make every reward meaningfully strong. By the time the player starts craving something new, they've leveled up to the next playstyle unlock, which kicks off the cycle once again. At max level, the player unlocks masteries which prompts them to retry all of the previous playstyles in combination with all of the unlocked power spikes, causing their commander to feel substantially more powerful and cementing a sense of accomplishment. Initially, this was fairly coarse-grained. Earlier commanders offer different playstyles that are largely reflective of their latter counterparts, like Bio vs Mech or Robo vs Twilight vs Stargate for Raynor and Artanis respectively. More recent commanders tighten up this reward loop and arguably make it much stronger. Stukov, Phoenix, and Han and Horner come to mind here. In Stukov's case, his playstyle always features a strong component of infested civilians, but the unlocks push the player to try a variety of supplementary army compositions from tanks to brood queens to mass bunkers. Phoenix consistently relies on champions, but the unlocks push players to try different host shells and army compositions. Han and Horner revolve around flying galleons, but the unlock progression explores a variety of different unit mixtures and approaches to different problems, like how to handle anti-air or how to defend a fixed location. One of the nice things about title reward loops is the variety they add to each commander. In Phoenix's case, I counted at least 5 distinct cycles, making him feel like one of the most diverse commanders in the pool. The playstyle selection and playstyle enhancement loops are very effective reward systems that achieve several important results. For one thing, players are guided through multiple interesting ways of playing the game, conferring a ton more mileage on each individual commander. This is great for players because it's more content to experience, and it's great for the developers because it's much simpler to build a new playstyle than build an entirely new commander. Mini reward loops also have another benefit in the way they mask the tedium of leveling new commanders. One of the inherent risks in separating experience by commander is a sense of diminishment a player might feel switching from a high to a low-level commander. Co-op mitigates this issue by encouraging players to focus on immediate rewards. It only takes a few games to unlock the most important upgrades for a commander's initial playstyle. This means you never feel like you need to grind out levels in order to unlock the quote-unquote real experience. This is further helped along by how unique each commander is. In combination with the emphasis on one playstyle at a time, players are less likely to view their experience as a weaker version of another high-level commander, simply because they're using entirely different units and upgrades. A third benefit of this system is a practical one. Co-op is easier to balance when the designers can assume players have a fully functioning playstyle by level 5 to 7. It would be a nightmare to balance hard around a specific level without knowing whether that's a realistic bar for every single commander. You'd end up building a wildly inconsistent experience in which some commanders are easy to level up and some commanders are really hard. By establishing a cutoff point where commanders are more or less fully functional, the designers could balance around that, while encouraging very low-level players to simply lower the difficulty. Related to this idea of full functionality is the learning period built into commander leveling. The strength of a playstyle is driven not only by the way the designer balances it, but also the efficacy of the player using it. Kerrigan is a good example. Her early game is balanced around effective use of a hero unit, especially the assimilation aura that snowballs her economy. But players need to actually figure this out. They need to use Kerrigan multiple times and learn how to play her effectively by experimenting with her abilities. By forcing them to do just that, the designers give players space to properly learn a commander and find some depth in their playstyle. This is super helpful from a balance perspective because the designers feel more confident about a player's ability to play any given commander, giving them more confidence about how powerful each commander will be at each level. Putting this all together, it's amazing how well the progression system works. It's engaging, rewarding, avoids repetition, and teaches you how to play correctly. I wonder how many iterations Blizzard required to arrive at the present state, or whether it was just obvious to them that it should work this way from the start. For me personally, it was most certainly not obvious, so I decided to work through some of the alternatives to understand why they wouldn't work as well. Probably the most standout decision here was the choice to feature a linear progression path. It comes across as old school game design and runs counter to the trend of giving players more choices. A branching or split skill tree offers several advantages. For one thing, players can pick their initial playstyle instead of having it picked for them. Players can also mix and match unlocks to create hybrid styles if that's their preference. That means more player agency, more player choice, and more strategic diversity. But this approach has its downsides as well. The most obvious is the way it conflicts with co-op's accessibility vision. Allowing players to make more choices inherently opens up the possibility of players making bad choices. It might sound like a good idea to spread upgrade points across playstyles, save them up and use several all at once, or focus on one upgrade path but play a hybrid style in-game. However, all of these choices will just end up kneecapping your commander and making them feel underpowered. A great point of comparison here is the campaign. Wings of Liberty features substantial freedom in its progression tree, and even splits upgrades out across research points and credits. Unfortunately, this means it's easy to forego important upgrades, or choose unlocks that don't synergize well with one another. I would guess this is why the most recent Nova DLC opted for a more forgiving slot-based system, in which players can move upgrades from unit to unit and reselect them prior to each mission. To build campaign-style, tree-based upgrade progression while retaining the accessibility vision, the designers would need to redo the upgrades in order to make them consistently powerful and picked out of order, which would drastically limit their creativity. Alternatively, they could water the upgrades down so they didn't matter as much. I guess you could also argue that a dynamic leveling system could work here as well, but that's a huge resource commitment, plus it's complexity on top of more complexity, instead of the much simpler approach that's on offer today. In general, none of these solutions seem better than the current implementation. Related to the accessibility vision is the notion of teaching players how to play. Why not scrap the mechanics that require skill to use and eliminate the teaching component entirely? You could imagine Kerrigan's assimilation aura being reworked into a passive buff, or Vorazen's Blink Stalkers getting straight damage upgrades instead. This has the opposite problem of branching skill trees in that it strips meaningful content out of the experience. By starting off a game of co-op, players are signaling their desire to play a decent game of StarCraft. They have an expectation to make some strategic and mechanical choices. If every upgrade were a straight passive buff, it would break players' sense of ownership in the experience. The process of learning how to play a commander builds a sense of attachment to that commander. From my perspective, this makes the experience more enjoyable and makes the player more likely to want to pick that commander in the future. What about pooling experience across commanders? This would eliminate the problem of down-leveling from a high to low level commander and ultimately make the experience feel less grindy. But I think this features a similar problem to removing skill-based mechanics. By allowing players to level up a commander without actually playing or learning them, players wouldn't feel a sense of attachment to their unlocks, and the reward loop would feel less meaningful. What about spreading upgrades out instead of co-locating them? In other words, get rid of the playstyle selection mechanic. This would encourage constant experimentation with hybrid playstyles. In aggregate, the player would end up practicing each playstyle as much as they do now, but with the added bonus of additional variety in unit compositions. I'd argue there's already data showing that this approach is not very effective. In several cases, commanders do break out of the mini reward loop cycle. Vorzin's Dark Archons are a good example. While they're unlocked at level 5, their upgrade cache appears at level 9, and the rewards in between focus on an unrelated unit. Speaking personally, this led me to avoid building Dark Archons. I had a similar experience with Karax, ironically for his most iconic playstyle of massing static defense. Because the upgrades are spread out across his entire progression tree, I spent my leveling time experimenting with mostly unrewarded unit compositions like Sentinel Energizer or Mass Immortal. Mass Cannons does turn out to be a fun playstyle in the end, but it doesn't feel like this is reinforced by the reward loop. In other cases, like Stukov and Zagira, the best power spikes are saved for the end rather than mixed into the entire tree. This makes the progression system feel lopsided. I'd argue it would be better to rearrange these upgrades so that they better align with mini playstyle selection loops. For example, move Zagira's Swarmling upgrade a few levels back in order to be adjacent to her Zergling upgrade cache. Stukov features a separate problem in that moving his bunker upgrade back only reinforces how much of his play centers around bunkers to begin with, although this is partly mitigated by the sheer enjoyment of learning how to play such an unconventional commander. In conclusion, co-op's progression system and its use of playstyle selection mini reward loops is both engaging and accessible. The general principles are highly replicable to other real-time strategy games. A straight-line progression system improves accessibility and balanceability, a playstyle selection cycle is a compelling reward loop that builds depth into each commander, and co-located unlocks focus players' attention on immediate rewards and prevent them from getting bored. Considered in the context of co-op's goals, these design choices feel substantially better than all of the alternatives, at least from my perspective. The designers really hit a home run here. One of the conclusions we can draw from this relates to the general principles around building accessible experiences, specifically what I'll label the paradox of making a game more accessible. This gets back to what we mentioned earlier about the benefits of limiting player choice. Outplay opportunities might be too confusing. A branching progression system might lead to bad decisions. Taking away these choices, in other words, limiting player agency, has a tangible benefit in that it leads to better outcomes for lower skilled players. Co-op, at least in these two instances, agreed with this line of thinking, choosing a more constrained but also more accessible gameplay experience. The lesson here is that real accessibility is not free. Like any other mechanic, it features trade-offs. This is something of a paradox, because in order to make your game more accessible to one audience, you probably have to make it less accessible, or at least less enjoyable, to another audience. Co-op is a great example of this, stripping out the greenfield freedom of competitive multiplayer in favor of a more streamlined and heavy-handed experience. That's not so much a criticism as it is a simple observation. Co-op features less player agency than the classic multiplayer experience, and this is very much by design. We've been talking about commanders for quite a while, so I think now is a good time to switch topics a bit and talk mission structure. While each mission features unique objectives and design elements, they all share the same fundamental structure. Missions are built on top of a skeleton of 3 primary event types: primary objectives, bonus objectives, and attack waves. In virtually every case, these events are configured to automatically pop up based on a timer. Failing to follow an objective almost always fails fast. If players choose not to follow directions, missions will end soon after. This is one of the most impactful choices in all of co-op. Players are almost never allowed to sit back and decide for themselves when to move out. This is true even on the lower difficulties. While the timer is adjusted to be more generous, it nevertheless still exists. This has the result of streamlining the flow of each mission by creating a predictable timeline of events. Primary objectives, bonus objectives, and attack waves occur at fixed times that are pre-specified by the designer. The result from the player's perspective is a much more consistent experience. That in turn is arguably more accessible than a mission structure that offered players more freedom, for much the same reason that we discussed with regard to the linear progression system. Probably the biggest effect is the way it enables the designers to plan out and balance the end-to-end experience, because everything can be laid out on a fixed timeline and easily reasoned about. For example, the designers know exactly when each attack wave will occur, meaning they can reliably predict how much fighting power players will have at that time and scale the difficulty up or down. The designers take advantage of this precision to do a bunch of interesting things. One is forcing out different build orders depending on the map and commander combination. For example, Rifts to Core Hall forces out a much more conservative opening than Missed Opportunities, because its initial attack wave occurs much earlier. This could also work the opposite way, like in Scythe of Amon, to create a lull in the action when players are intended to take a second base. One of the patterns I noticed here is the way primary objectives line up with the different phases of the player's development. Almost every mission features between 3 and 5 sets of primary objectives. The first set corresponds to the player's initial unit composition and opening build. The next 2 to 3 sets correspond with their power spikes as they research upgrades and build out their units. And the final set is a crescendo of action as the player's maxed out army clashes with a massive enemy force. I actually first noticed this emphasis on 3 to 5 when I was playing Oblivion Express and realized that it features many more waves than most of the other maps. At the time I was leveling up Zagera, who's not that strong at lower levels, and I was trying to figure out how to align my build order with the different waves of objectives. I realized that just by adding a handful of additional waves, this problem had become much more complicated. Instead of planning for 3 phases of a game, I felt like I was planning for 5 or 6. I think this is part of the reason that all but one of the later missions stick to the 3 to 5 formula. The Vermilion problem breaks the trend by featuring 6 or more waves of mineral collection. The designers balance this out by making it a more drawn-out experience, but that's made the map infamous as being somewhat boring and tedious. Fixing events to a timeline is also used to facilitate player cooperation, like lining up the third primary objective with an attack wave in Mal Warfare. This cooperation aspect is where we see the first evolution in mission design over co-op's lifecycle. At launch, co-op featured 5 missions, 6 if you include Lock and Load, which was released around 30 days later and therefore developed alongside the other missions. Of those 6, 4 require explicit cooperation on the primary objective: simultaneous presence to lock void shards, simultaneous appearances of void thrashers attacking the temple, simultaneous trains on separate tracks, and simultaneous shuttle launches headed to different warp conduits. By contrast, only 3 of the 9 missions introduced thereafter require explicit player cooperation on the primary objective: accompanying Janara in Chain of Ascension, placing artifact trucks in Cradle of Death, and attacking different suppression towers in Mal Warfare. Implicit cooperation is preferred instead, timing out events such that it's difficult for one player to do everything simultaneously. This is typically done via bonus objectives. A good example is Missed Opportunities, where ideally one player should proactively clear the Terrazine geysers while the other tackles the bonus objective. I don't necessarily think this was a change in philosophy per se. Rather, I think the designers just fine-tuned the nature of cooperation instead of challenging the core idea itself. In a 2016 developer update, Matt Morris, at the time the lead co-op designer, had this to say when asked why each mission featured a strong time constraint. If we allow players to just sit around and build up their bases, we'd never be able to create a mission that is engaging and challenging. Having that time pressure is what gets players to move out from their defenses and coordinate with their partner. Nothing encourages cooperation better than the proactive objective structure, and I'd argue that's the biggest reason the missions are all designed this way. In the absence of this fundamental skeleton, players would have to fall back on explicit communication in order to coordinate. Not only would this be impractical given language and cultural differences, it would also be tedious because players would need to adjust their playstyle for every new partner they encountered. This would end up being every game. The vast majority of my co-op missions featured a unique partner. This is a good lead-in to a more general discussion of co-op as a single-player game versus co-op as a multiplayer game. Now, co-op is of course multiplayer, but its design elements don't always factor in collaboration with a second player. The core commander design is a good example of this. The developers build out commander concepts by considering how a commander would play if they received their own single-player campaign. The loose coupling and player coordination is another good example, enabling players to more or less do their own thing without always worrying about what their partner is doing. To me, this is part of the secret sauce of what makes cooperatives so successful. It manages to solve the most obvious problems associated with team-based gameplay without sacrificing most of their benefits. More importantly, it considers the standalone experience as a first-class citizen, refusing to rely on the dynamic nature of multiplayer as some sort of mechanical crutch. From my perspective, this is one of the clearest differentiators between cooperative missions and the kind of content you see on the StarCraft arcade. The heavy-handed approach to objective design is the perfect example. Not only does it make the experience more accessible from a standalone perspective, it's also an enabler of the multiplayer, an implicit mediator between players to facilitate a consistently fun multiplayer experience. Next, I'd like to separately address the second question. What benefits does cooperative gain from even featuring a second player? Now obviously this is partly a creative and business decision. Blizzard wanted to build an accessible multiplayer experience, and allowing players to partner up to fight against the computer is a good way to accomplish that. When co-op was first announced, the design team emphasized teamwork as one of the game mode's defining characteristics. Here's Matt Morris again, this time discussing the design of Alarak in an interview with Loco. One of the things that we talk about a lot when we develop these commanders is, we want to have this relationship with the other commanders. Alarak doesn't have a ton of anti-air. I mean, he does have the Slayers, which is the Tal'Darim version of the Stalker. He's focused on bringing the harder hitting Wrathwalkers, his Immortals, that it really allows to say, hey, communicate with your ally like, hey, we need anti-air on this one. I'll take care of the ground, and you take care of the air. So we're looking for these kinds of synergy moments with each of these commanders. It would be too intimidating to pin this on a single player, for example by offering them control of 2 separate armies. Simultaneously, there would be too much overlap to pull this off with 3 or more players, given that there are a limited number of roles for units to fill in. What's interesting to me is whether the decision to have players synergize came after the decision to build cooperative missions, or whether the creative ideas around synergy drove the decision to create cooperative missions in the first place. I'm honestly not sure, but either way the 2 choices dovetail in a way that you couldn't have one without the other. The question is, which one was the creative choice, and which was the practical decision that aligned with it? I'd further argue that there's a bunch of practical benefits to 2-player missions. In comparison with the solo campaign, co-op offers vastly more gameplay variety. There are literally hundreds of commander, map, and enemy type combinations, to the point where it's unlikely to repeat one without manually picking your partner ahead of time. This prevents players from getting bored, and adds a ton more variety to the game mode. Fortunately for us, we can actually make this comparison directly. Many co-op missions are based heavily on maps from the single-player campaign. A good example is the Oblivion Express cooperative mission, which is virtually identical to the Great Train Robbery from the Wings of Liberty campaign. While I find both to be enjoyable, it'd be hard to play the campaign version more than 5 or 6 times without getting bored. One of the big reasons for that is that a single-player mission is much more constrained in how much multitasking it can impose on the player. The Great Train Robbery limits itself to 1 event at a time, spaced out by at least 1 to 2 minutes, whereas Oblivion Express features all 3 event types in rapid succession, sometimes simultaneously. It's much more action-packed and exciting than the campaign corollary. The designers in co-op have much more freedom in this respect because there are 2 players working together. More recent mission designs push the envelope even further. The latest map, Cradle of Death, allows for up to 4 simultaneous events by adding a new randomized event type, in which a player's artifact truck is targeted by enemy forces. If 2 players is better than 1, does that mean 4 players would be better than 2? From my perspective, no. Designing missions for 3 or more players is infinitely more complex than designing them for 1 or 2. Balance is harder because a mission has to be sufficiently difficult for 4 players. This means it would likely be impossible to solo, making unskilled partners much more painful than the current experience. It's noteworthy that most of today's co-op missions are balanced such that 2 players can control their armies exclusively with select all army and attack move, so long as they divvy up the work in a reasonable way. This implies that a single good player can easily split their forces across 2 sections and carry the weight of someone much worse than them. 4 players would also strain system resources in a way that's probably unrealistic for StarCraft 2's system requirements. Additionally, it would be much more difficult to match 4 players instead of 2, which is why you sometimes encounter a co-op partner who's running at a different difficulty level than you are. Both of these concerns are partly why a difficulty level higher than Brutal has never been added. Needless to say, this is not some kind of universal conclusion. The arcade provides plenty of examples of casual content ranging from 1 to 8 players. But for a game mode targeted at the entire StarCraft 2 audience, 2 players fighting against a computer is arguably the optimal choice. It's action-packed, but accessible, allows for cooperation, but doesn't necessarily mandate it, and it features a social component without straining the matchmaking system or underlying system resources. I'd like to dive a little deeper into the different event types and talk a little bit about what they accomplish. We've already spent some time talking about the primary objectives. Their proactive design produces an accessible and predictable experience that makes it easy for players to cooperate implicitly. The attack waves and bonus objectives also play important roles in the structure of each mission. From my perspective, they allow co-op to feature a pacing that's much more accessible than the competitive multiplayer. Pacing is just the ups and downs of the gameplay experience, the peaks and valleys of excitement and calm respectively. I'll walk through a simple example for an adventure game. The player starts off neutral in a town, moves up the excitement graph as they clear a dungeon, peaks in excitement as they clear the boss, and finally relaxes by watching a cutscene and returning home. StarCraft's competitive mode features a pretty frenetic pacing, jumping rapidly from peaks to valleys. Generally speaking, the better you get at the game, the more you tend to see this in a calmer and more orderly way. Newer players, by contrast, tend to experience the game at larger extremes, because they don't know as much about what they're supposed to do at any given time. Smoothing out this graph generally involves losing games in order to understand how the game flows, essentially to build game knowledge. This reduces your sense of calm because you always have something to do, but it also levels out the peaks because you understand how the game is structured and tend to see things coming. That's great, and this process contributes to the great sense of accomplishment associated with the competitive multiplayer. But unfortunately, it's just not very accessible. Many players don't want to lose games or study build orders in order to enjoy real-time strategy. Co-op solves this problem through its proactive pacing. Players are never left wondering what they should do next. It's clearly called out to them right from the start, with a timer indicating how long they have to complete each objective. The attack waves and bonus objectives smooth out the pacing curve by enabling smaller step transitions from calm to excitement and vice versa. It's probably easiest to explain this using an example. I'll walk through Rifts to Core Hall, one of the original co-op missions available at launch, and talk about how this mission plays out on Brutal. I'll place arrows on the screen to illustrate the pacing. Up means it's a period of excitement, 2 ups means it's a period of great excitement, and a dash means that it's a neutral period. Players start in a relaxed state, building up their economy and deciding on their opener. Next, they tackle the first attack wave. This leads into a period of calm as they clear their second base. Next, players tackle the second attack wave. This crescendos into an assault on the rift itself. This leads to a longer period of calm as players build up to the mid-game. This leads to the third attack wave, followed by a second crescendo as players kill the next set of void shards. Players step down their excitement by clearing the first bonus objective, and then there's a period of calm as they build up once again. This leads to a step up in excitement to tackle the fourth attack wave, then another crescendo to destroy the third set of shards, a step down to destroy the second bonus objective, a final period of calm to build the final unit composition, a step up to destroy the fifth attack wave, and a final crescendo to destroy the last set of shards. Each event transitions smoothly from one state to another. There are no disorienting lurches back and forth between peaks and valleys. While it is true that this is an ideal timeline on arguably the best paced map in the pool, the general pacing structure holds up across all 15 maps. It helps that, across the board, the sequence of events is predictable, with every objective displayed clearly on the player's screen. The result from the player's perspective is a more fluid experience. Co-op feels good to play because its pacing is proactive and imposed on its players. This is ultimately more accessible because players are not left to their own devices to smooth out a frenetic pacing graph. Instead, it's all laid out in front of them by the designer. The trade-off is that players ultimately have less agency in terms of how they approach each mission, consistent with how the designers approached the progression system we discussed previously. This is actually a good lead-in to a discussion of target audience more broadly. If you're not familiar with the term, target audience just refers to the people that a game is intended for. A difficult action game like Dark Souls will appeal to a different group of people than an exploration adventure like Banjo-Kazooie. Naturally, there will be some overlap because both groups enjoy playing computer games. In general, however, the two games are intended for two distinct groups of people. At launch, co-op focused on casual players looking for an accessible version of the classic StarCraft experience. Its initial missions drew heavily from the single-player campaign, and its commander designs adopted a ladder fantasy approach inspired by the competitive multiplayer. The pacing that we just discussed is critical here as well. It argued that casual players are more susceptible to problems in pacing because they're just not as attached to the game as a more hardcore fan. I was even surprised in my research to find that co-op was originally structured to be completable. Mastery levels only came post-launch in patch 3.3. So far, this video has looked at co-op primarily through the lens of this target audience, talking about things like the progression system, intended mission design, and explicit versus implicit cooperation. But there's another side to co-op that I'd like to discuss next. The hardcore audience looking for endgame content and competitive challenges. These players already have maxed out commanders. They approach missions in unconventional and sometimes unintended ways, and they can often even solo missions without assistance from their partner. One of the ways the developers tried to reach this audience is through the weekly mutations. Mutations modify existing cooperative missions, adding on mutators that increase the difficulty and encourage players to think more strategically. Co-op features dozens of unique mutators. One of my favorites is called microtransactions, wherein players pay a minerals and Vespene gas fee anytime they move their units. Mutations are typically harder than normal cooperative missions, often substantially so. There's also usually a strong cooperation component that encourages strategic planning ahead of time. These two factors lead me to believe that this game mode is primarily targeted at hardcore players. In practice, however, I think the results are a bit more complicated. I'll start from my own perspective as a casual player. What I like about mutations is the way they feel like a puzzle. It's very rare to be able to beat a mutation without thinking through how you're going to approach each different mutator. Once you've got some ideas, you spend a few tries figuring out what's going on, you iterate on your plan, you eventually figure it out, and the sense of accomplishment from beating the mission feels pretty good. It's noteworthy that this rarely comes down to mechanics, at least from my perspective. Most mutations feel geared toward rewarding good strategies, so long as they're applied by sufficiently high-level commanders. Every week, I log into co-op and I check out what the new mutation is. If it doesn't seem fun, I just skip it, or I play it on hard instead of brutal. In this sense, mutations are similar to free content updates, like the new costumes that are occasionally released in Mario Kart. Sometimes I'm interested, and sometimes I'm not. Either way it's free, so I'm not complaining. More broadly, my perspective as a casual player treats co-op not so differently from other kinds of single-player content. It's a completable experience, and anything beyond maxing out commanders is just bonus content. Let's switch our perspective to a more hardcore player. All of our commanders are already maxed out at mastery level 90, so the bonus experience doesn't affect us. Blizzard sometimes repeats mutations, so odds are we've actually seen this mutation before. Even when the mutation does interest us, and even when we do have some levels to grind, we're only incentivized to complete the mutation once per week. After that, we stop receiving bonus experience. If we choose to challenge ourselves by speedrunning or clearing the entire map, there's no leaderboard to confirm our accomplishments or rank us against other players. Even when the mutation itself does provide a good challenge, sometimes that's just because it's unfair. Wheel of Misfortune is the most infamous example here. In contrast with my positive view as a casual player, hardcore folks will probably approach mutations as a disappointing and truncated attempt at an endgame. And that's not the only issue. Mastery skills feature a similar design flaw. For casual players, it's neat to slot out your masteries in preparation for experimenting with a new style. But for more hardcore players, grinding out games on random commander mode, it's actually kind of a pain. Because masteries are typically geared towards specific tactics or unit compositions, and because you have to choose them ahead of time, they essentially push you into a predetermined playstyle. You can't decide in-game, because by then your masteries are already locked in. It seems to me like masteries were designed for people to play one-off games, not to grind out lots of games in a row. I'd like to be careful not to overstate this argument. There's more to co-op than just new content or experimenting with new styles. There's a good amount of replayability within the different maps and commanders. I've been redoing the grind in the North American region just because it's so much fun. But in my research, the endgame was by far the source of most of the game mode's complaints. Aside from limitations in the leveling and mutation systems, players also complain that co-op becomes too easy at very high levels. Relative to the target audience that it tries to engage with, co-op's endgame is arguably its weakest component. I'd argue that this is a result of the developer's original vision, to build a more accessible version of the competitive multiplayer targeting more casual players. Because they didn't plan for an extensive endgame, it's not surprising that what they ended up building comes across as tacked on and somewhat gimmicky. This is arguably a lesson to the developers. As it turns out, there are a lot of players looking for ongoing, hardcore content and competitive challenges, but who would still prefer the confines of a more straightforward and strongly structured game mode like cooperative. The last thing I'll say here is that I do think the developers are working to solve this problem. On the commander side, every new commander except Abathur is recommended for experienced players. With the exception of Han and Horner, who feel ridiculously simple to play, this is completely accurate, with later released commanders like Stukov and Phoenix featuring distinctive mechanics, most certainly tailored to experienced players. Cradle of Death, the most recent cooperative map, ups the ante with up to 4 simultaneous event types. This map feels to me like the most frenetic, hopefully catering to the desire for more difficult challenges, or at least more action. With the event types out of the way, I'd like to talk a little bit about the meat and potatoes of mission structure, the different types of missions, the expansion mechanics, and the decisions around game speed. One of the things I tried to do as part of this review was to categorize the different missions. My goal here was to create a set of design archetypes. I struggled with this task because what was similar on paper felt incorrect when I compared them with my actual in-game experiences. For example, Oblivion Express, Void Launch, and Dead of Night all feature a strong defensive component, but they feel very different to play. Chasing the trains in Oblivion Express is a very different experience from escorting the research vessel while dealing with incoming shuttles. Meanwhile, Dead of Night mandates the player push out and assault some pretty difficult fixed locations, whereas this is completely optional in the other two maps. One of the loose ends I kept coming back to is a throwaway line from a Matt Morris interview I referenced earlier. He had this to say when discussing the commanders and maps the development team had in the pipeline. We're also building lots of co-op missions. Those take a little bit longer than the commanders, as you can understand. As we do a lot of balance, we do multiple bases. This really surprised me. Maps sound pretty simple to put together if you think about them in terms of high-level categories. First, you take the high-level semantics of an existing map, then you leverage a unique backstory, objective design, art palette, and environmental details to make it feel unique. On the surface, many maps in co-op fit this basic description. Think about the similarities between Rifts to Korhal, Void Thrashing, and Scythe of Aemon. But I'd argue if you dive deeper, map design is more complex than this. Maps serve as a foundation, kind of like a partially filled-in canvas on which players can explore the different ways of playing the same commander. Rifts to Korhal and Void Thrashing might feature a similar setup, but the latter exerts more time pressure and forces out a scrappier, more aggressive playstyle. Scythe of Aemon also looks similar on the surface, but it's unique in its emphasis on mobility and positioning. Void Launch and Dead of Night both focus on defense of a fixed location, but they differ in their second dimension, mobility for the former and damage per second for the latter. I think it's better to think about this in terms of commander characteristics, and to view individual missions as emphasizing particular aspects of each commander's play. Each commander features different pros and cons across a number of gameplay dimensions: economy and startup time, defensibility, mobility, multitasking, sieging a fixed point, damage per second, call-down abilities, detection and cloaking, and so forth. Individual missions emphasize particular dimensions in order to highlight the different aspects to playing a commander. I think this is why Mr. Morris emphasized the difficulty of creating new maps. It's not as simple as starting from a coarse-grained category. Instead, you need to select one or two dimensions to index on from the broad swath of characteristics present on every commander. Next, you need to translate this into practical reality, meaning all of the complexities of balancing and pacing and so on. I'd call this the grab bag approach to mission design, and while I think it would have good results, it also sounds quite laborious. Ultimately, however, I think it's a more accurate way of approaching mission design. Missions inherently can't be viewed in isolation. They're part and parcel with the commanders, no pun intended. Before I go on, I'd like to reiterate that the precise process Blizzard uses to build maps has never been made public. Commander Dimensions is just conjecture on my part, a combination of working backwards from what's available today, plus my own personal opinions on good and bad frameworks for individual mission design. Across all of the maps, I did identify one unifying characteristic: the consistency of mechanics within a single mission. Every cooperative mission takes the same basic concept for their primary objective and simply repeats it multiple times. I previously called this a wave-based approach to objective design. This doesn't mean that missions don't feature multiple mechanics. Rather, it's to say, whatever mechanics the mission settles upon, they're consistent from the first to the last objective. For example, Scythe of Aemon emphasizes both mobility and attacking a fixed point, but this remains the focus from start to finish. I don't think this is fundamentally that different from the campaign, which also features a lot of missions centered around a single idea and all of its various permutations. I mention it both to reinforce the importance of the wave-based approach to co-op's objective design, and to point out that what seems repetitive on paper is actually pretty engaging in practice. Subjectively, I also feel that co-op is a bit more streamlined than the single-player missions. For example, the Devil's Playground from Wings of Liberty features a similar lava mechanic as the Vermilion problem, but it feels a lot more difficult to deal with in the campaign than in the co-op missions. Related to this subject are the expansion mechanics themselves. None of co-op's missions feature more than 2 intended mining bases. This is again similar to the campaign. In contrast with the competitive multiplayer, players are never asked to expand to 3 or more bases. It seems to me like the designers felt the late-game StarCraft economy might be too complicated for their intended target audience. This gets back to the fundamental mission structure we were just discussing. Co-op missions feature a strong military focus, emphasizing the speed and depth that exemplify StarCraft 2's overall design. The economy is mostly a secondary factor that plays into the pacing and balancing decisions. There's nothing really remarkable about this, except to point out that the nature of StarCraft 2 lends itself to these kinds of missions. I could imagine cooperative missions in a different kind of real-time strategy game, in which players collaborate to build monuments, construct cities, or set up trade routes. It all depends on the mechanics the game is centered around. I adopt a similar line of thinking to the design decisions around game speed. Co-op leverages a tiered speed system. Normal is slower than hard, hard is slower than brutal, and brutal runs at the same speed as the competitive multiplayer. This is a pretty elegant solution to a difficult balancing problem. StarCraft 2 is a very fast game, which might make it inaccessible to players with weaker mechanics. If a player chooses a lower difficulty setting, it makes sense to slow the game down at the same time. Co-op faces a harder problem than the campaign in a few respects. The presence of a second player means that there's no setting to adjust your own individual game speed. Players are also expected to play on lower difficulties when using lower level commanders. They're not intended to always play brutal. Furthermore, even when players do queue for brutal, they can get matched with a hard player if the matchmaker can't find them a suitable partner. As a result, the game ends up feeling tediously slow if you're used to playing on faster. It's something you get used to over time, but at the start it's always a bit painful. I don't really see a good solution to this problem, but it feels similar to the military focus of co-op that we just discussed. The game speed issue is a side effect of being StarCraft 2, not a natural result of cooperative missions. I can imagine a future Blizzard game avoiding this problem entirely if it were structured to be slower paced. To be clear, that's not a suggestion, nor is it a criticism. It's an observation that co-op is not a blank slate, and it builds on top of a game with highly impactful design decisions around economy and unit control. Related to the mission structure, I'd like to do a very short section on co-op's narrative design. Each cooperative mission features a single narrator who explains the mission's backstory in the first couple minutes. They also narrate most of the mission's later events, with the exception of enemy attack waves that are narrated by the commanders themselves. Players don't need any foundation in the lore to understand the goals of each mission, but experienced players will appreciate the various in-jokes and references made to the game's backstory. The narrative design is exceedingly lightweight. It hangs on a handful of facial animations and a bunch of snappy dialogue. From my perspective, this ends up working really well. All of the characters feel like they have so much color, so much life to them. Consider someone like Sergeant Hammer. There's enough structure there to give you a good sense of who the character is, but enough free space for your imagination to fill in the details. This makes her come across as a much fuller and more established character, because you end up writing a lot of the narrative in your own head. Consider Sergeant Morales from Dead of Night. This character feels a lot more real to me, partly because so many details have been omitted. The situation is obviously fantastically unreal, and any attempt to ground it in a proper narrative arc would probably break my immersion. The lighter weight facial animations, especially the comical winks she mixes in during certain dialogue segments, go a lot further in making the situation more believable. On top of the lightweight narrator cards, another thing I liked was the hand-drawn commander designs on the loading screen. Again, these feel to me like a call to your imagination. I get a much stronger feeling about Dahaka or Kerrigan from looking at their drawings than I do from their in-engine renderings. In general, these are small details, but put together they add a lot to the experience. Co-op does not by any means need a strong narrative design, but the humble components the developers opted to include do end up accomplishing a lot anyway. It reminded me a lot of the campaign openings in StarCraft 1. Sure, it was just text and audio dialogue, but it ended up feeling a lot more epic because it leveraged your imagination instead of fancy cutscenes. In this last section, I'm going to touch upon a bunch of random topics that didn't really fit in anywhere else. Let's start with the enemy AI. I think randomizing enemy unit compositions is a good way to keep the game mode fresh, and force out more variety from each commander. One thing I particularly like is the simplicity. Units either sit passively, or they attack move from point A to point B. There's no complex scripted events that could glitch out and break your immersion. Related to this topic is the general concept of RNG. Over co-op's lifecycle, the developers have become more comfortable adding in randomized components. Examples here include Hunterlings on Dead of Night, and attack waves on Artifact Trucks in Cradle of Death. This is a tricky subject because much of co-op's accessibility comes from how structured the experience is. That said, the fact that later maps are also harder than the launch set indicate that the developer's bar for what's inaccessible has actually changed over time. From my perspective, a little RNG goes a long way, but too much and it would start to conflict with the game mode's other design tenets. I was happy to see generic RTS concepts make their way into co-op. Simple balancing ideas like featuring a constraint resource in Vespene Gas ensure that co-op sits on a solid gameplay foundation. Co-op is also practical in that while it forgoes the strategic and mechanical constraints of competitive multiplayer, it is still a very mechanical game mode. Real-time strategy players like real-time strategy mechanics. Building stuff feels good, commanding armies feels good, earning income feels good. Stripping these out in the name of accessibility is almost always a misunderstanding of the audience, and I'm glad co-op didn't go that route. I was interested by the developers' approach to balance. In general, they tend to buff commanders instead of nerfing them. Players typically don't like nerfs to their own playstyles, so this is a nice way to add strategic diversity without making anyone unhappy. The downside is that it makes the game mode easier. This forces the designers to balance missions toward higher difficulties. This makes commanders relatively weaker, and this prompts another round of buffs. There's a tricky balance here between commander strength and map difficulty, and I'm curious to see how the developers approach it going forward. The maps are already in a weird state because the launch missions are substantially easier than what came later. On top of buffs like Raynor's insane battlecruisers, some missions end up feeling somewhat trivial for high-level commanders. Finally, I was pretty surprised that co-op doesn't feature any kind of tutorial. More surprising is that the preview videos are rendered at a very low resolution, and the player can't skip through them to get to the parts they care about. It's kind of amazing to me that a game mode designed around accessibility skipped and downplayed what feel to me like pretty crucial features. Thankfully, as long as players don't pick brutal for their first mission, the proactive objective structure can carry the weight while players get their feet wet. We're nearing the end of our review here, so before we close out I'd like to cover some fun trivia, namely the statistics of the cooperative games I played for this review. Over 3 months, I played 281 non-mutation co-op missions, totaling more than 80 hours of play. The median brutal game was roughly 18 real-time minutes in length, reaching up to 21 and 24 minutes at the 90th and 99th percentiles respectively. The most common commanders I got partnered with were Raynor, Dahaka, and Karax. The least common were Abathur, Alarak, and Kerrigan. The distribution here was pretty even, but there was still a big gap between the two ends of the spectrum. Raynor was almost 5 times more popular than Abathur. Of the 174 partners with English character names, meaning I could retrieve their data from the Battle.net API, 63 had completed their placements on the 2018 Season 2 competitive ladder. This indicates that, in Korea, a sizable 36% of co-op players also play some form of ladder, whether it be 1v1 or team games. My overall win rate on non-mutation missions was 90% on brutal and 98% on hard. On your screen you'll see a full breakdown. The easiest maps were Rifts to Korhal, Part and Parcel, The Vermilion Problem, and Lock and Load with a 100% win rate. The hardest maps were Scythe of Aemon and Metal Warfare with a 73% win rate. On the end game, I completed 14 different mutations. The hardest was number 115 Field of Screams, requiring 11 unique attempts to beat on Brutal. Finally, I successfully soloed 5 maps, once on hard and 4 times on Brutal. In terms of my personal preferences, my favorite commanders were Artanis and Phoenix because they felt the funnest and smoothest to play. Lots of different unit compositions, very easy to handle, and very fun to use. Zagera also stood out as incredibly fun, particularly for mutations. My least favorite commander was Stukov because I found him pretty tedious. Also, just to be honest, the frame drops were a factor here as well. I thought the easiest commanders were Abathur and Han and Horner. Abathur because you can just mass roaches, and Han and Horner because they're super simple and ridiculously strong. I thought the hardest commanders were Stukov and Zagera. Stukov because he has so many different tech paths, and because managing rally points is a bit of a pain. Zagera because she's quite difficult to use before her high-level Swarmling and Splitter Strain upgrades. My favorite maps were Void Thrashing and Rifts to Korhal, and my least favorite was Scythe of Aemon. I can't quite put my finger on it, but I feel like the pacing on this map just isn't timed out correctly. The bonus objectives feel like they don't pop out at times that make sense. When I started this review, I knew it would be a huge undertaking. Before this point, I had never really played much co-op, always assuming that a hardcore player like myself would be happier on the ladder. I decided to take on this project because of co-op's immense runaway success. The developers have gone on record stating it's more popular than even the competitive multiplayer itself. I wanted to know why that is. I wanted to dig in and learn something new. After more than 100 hours of playing, researching, and writing, I'm really glad I decided to do so. Co-op is a fantastic experience. It solves many of real-time strategy's pernicious accessibility problems without watering down the experience or taking away from the competitive multiplayer. The linear progression tree pushes players to play the game in a fun and effective way. The strongly structured objective design ensures games have a good pacing that flows smoothly from one moment to the next. In terms of level design, the missions use consistent, wave-based mechanics to build an engaging but easy-to-understand experience, and they leverage a grab-bag approach to commander characteristics in order to tease out the complexities and nuances of every single commander. Players are encouraged to cooperate, sometimes through explicit instruction, but mostly through strong implicit incentives that reduce the need for clumsy communication. The endgame is not necessarily what it could have been, but that's a lesson in and of itself. As it turns out, there's an audience of hardcore players looking to grind out missions and play competitive challenges, but still within the comfortable confines of a strongly structured and proactively paced game mode like cooperative. Not everything is generic and transferable to the genre as a whole. Co-op's military focus and decisions around game speed are basically inherited from StarCraft 2 instead of proactively designed. But these are details among larger brushstrokes. What the team has accomplished here goes way beyond StarCraft. They found a way to make multiplayer accessible, engaging, and highly replayable, all at the same time. This is a remarkable achievement for a niche genre, considered too difficult for modern gamers accustomed to pick up and play competitors. David Sum, the lead co-op designer in 2017, dove into this in an interview. Do you feel like the co-op mode is paving a new type of game mode for future RTS games by other companies? That sounds pretty arrogant. I wouldn't say that, but if you want to say it, I would be very flattered to hear that. Genre changing? I don't know about that, but I do think it's got a whole lot of potential. If Mr. Sum isn't going to say it, then I will. Co-op is a revolution in real-time strategy. It offers a new approach to the trade-offs between a fixed and accessible campaign mode, a never-ending but intimidating competitive ladder, and the Wild West of custom arcade games. It goes another way, happily drawing players from all three audiences without detracting from any of the other game modes. Perhaps even more importantly, it discovers an entirely new audience of hardcore players looking for challenging endgame content, but still within the confines of a strongly structured game mode like cooperative. On top of all this, co-op creates a paradigm shift in what it means to be in the real-time strategy business. It's a genuinely long-term business model that's delightful for both players and developers alike. Co-op expands the potential of the entire real-time strategy genre, and I wouldn't be surprised if we look back and see this as the start of an entirely new way of thinking about real-time strategy games. Alrighty, that's everything I had for today. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, I'd love it if you followed me here and on Twitter and Facebook to receive regular content updates. The relevant links are in the description below. All the best, and see you next time.